Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first Lupina Center for Spirituality, Healthcare, and Ethics lecture of the year. Tonight, we're extraordinarily pleased to have Professor Carl Elliott from the University of Minnesota speaking. Professor Elliott has both an MD degree and a PhD in philosophy, the latter from the University of Glasgow, where he worked on issues of ethics and insanity. Since then, Professor Elliott has wrote, over the last 15 years, a number of books at this intersection of philosophy, medicine, and culture. And so some of his earlier works, one he edited was called The Last Physician, Walker Percy and the Moral Life of Medicine. Another book was called Slow Cures and Bad Philosophers, Essays on Wittgenstein, Medicine, and Bioethics. He then had a book called A Philosophical Disease, Bioethics, Culture, and Identity. And then perhaps the book that the most of you will be familiar with is a truly extraordinary book, which I highly recommend to all of you, Better Than Well. His book he published in 2003, a series of essays published in a variety of journals like Harper's, Atlantic Monthly, and others, that really looks in a rather profound way at the way, specifically American, but I think they also apply to us as Canadians, American ideals of happiness, of self-fulfillment, radically shape and reshape and rethink how medicine understands its purposes, or telos, to use a more philosophical term. And I recommend that to you. And then in this past year, or just in the last month in Canada, his book, A White Coat, Black Hat, Adventures on the Dark Side of Medicine, has been published. And I also want to give a brief plug for Crux Books, the theological bookseller at the Toronto School of Theology, is selling it to you at a reduced price of $14. So I encourage you, I think that's about the best deal in town for this book, so I encourage you to support them, as they've been very supportive of the Toronto School of Theology. I hope that's an acceptable sponsor, though they're not actually sponsoring the event. And then after Professor Elliott has finished speaking, Trudeau Lemons, professor of the William Scholl Chair in Health Law and Policy over at University of Toronto Law School, will speak. He holds law degrees both from the Catholic University of Leuven and from McGill University. He's been a fellow at a variety of institutions over the last number of years, including the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and visiting professor at the University of Otago, as well as other places. And his particular academic interests are in the interaction between law regulation and ethical norms in the context of healthcare and medical research and in health product development. So first we welcome Professor Elliott, and then Professor Lemons will respond briefly to Professor Elliott. Please welcome Professor Elliott.
So I'm okay without the microphone. There's a microphone here, but everybody can hear me okay? I prefer not to use it, actually, if that's suitable. Trudeau, can you hear me all right? Yeah. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a great day, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion this evening. I should apologize, actually, at the beginning. A lot of what I say here will be relevant to Canada. I used to work at McGill, but it's been almost 14 years since I left, so I haven't kept up as much with the Canadian context as the American situation. But I do know a little bit about the way things have played out here, and I think a lot of this is relevant. So let me just start with a story for you. This was, I guess, probably the late 90s, shortly after I moved from McGill to Minnesota. And I was in my office at the Bioethics Center, and I get a phone call. And it's from a psychiatrist in town by the name of Farouk Abuzahab. And he was calling because he wanted a favor from me. And the favor was, he explained, that apparently there had been some trouble in a research study that he had done. And he was being disciplined by the state licensing board. And he'd been told by the licensing board that as part of his disciplinary action, he needed to take a class in medical ethics. And he saw that I was teaching one that term, and so he wanted to know if he could sit in. I've got to say, I wasn't terribly happy about the idea of my class as an instrument of punishment. For wayward psychiatrists, I never had a request like that, but he seemed very affable on the phone, and so I thought, why not? He told me he'd been on the faculty at the university for a long time before he'd gone into private practice. In fact, he told me that he used to be chair of the state Psychiatric Society's ethics board. And so I agreed to let him sit in, and it was fine. I mean, the class went fine. He came every week, he talked, and I didn't give a whole lot more thought to the guy until a few years later when I came across this for-profit testing center, clinical trial center in St. Paul. It was called Prism Research. And I'd come across them because they were advertising in a local paper for research subjects. So I went to the website, and I was looking over their list of researchers, and I see that this guy, Farouk Abuzahab, was one of them. And I thought, hey, that's a familiar name. And then I thought, I started Googling, and I found out that he was also doing research studies in his private practice in town. And so I started to wonder, I wonder what that guy did to get disciplined and get sent to my class. Well, it turned out that it wasn't just one incident. There were actually 46 incidents. According to the licensing board, he was responsible for the deaths and injuries of 46 different patients. The deaths were all suicides. 17 were subjects in research studies that he had been doing. The board had judged him a danger to patients, a danger to the public health, and taken his license away and ordered him to take an ethics class, hence his phone call to me. So what exactly were these incidents like? Well, I'll tell you about one of them because it was written up in the Boston Globe. This was about a 41-year-old woman named Susan Endersby, who'd been struggling for years with schizophrenia, with suicidal thoughts, had been doing fairly well on her medication in the hospital when she was referred to Dr. Abuzahab. Dr. Abuzahab had a contract with the drug company, Abbott, to do a new antipsychotic study. The study guidelines prohibited enrolling subjects at risk of suicide, but he enrolled Endersby anyway. During the first couple of weeks of the study, she was taken off her old meds, including her regular antipsychotic, and she started to get dramatically worse. She started talking about suicide again. You can actually look at the nursing notes. They're included in his disciplinary file. And you can see this very clearly. She's talking about leaving the unit and jumping off a bridge. So what does Abuzahab do? A couple of weeks into the study, he writes her a day pass to leave the hospital unsupervised. She walks out the front door, goes to the Franklin Street Bridge, jumps into the Mississippi River, and drowns. That's one of 46 cases. And it's not a hard case to find. It was written up in the Boston Globe, one of the most widely read newspapers in the United States. If you Google his name, that is the first hit that comes up. You can get his entire disciplinary file from the state licensing board. It's posted online. This is all public information. Yet, none of this seems to have seriously damaged his research career. He's still doing studies. He's still making lots of money. He's still working for the pharmaceutical industry. Now, cases like that are troubling, and they're troubling in a new way. Because in bioethics, up until fairly recently, we were used to thinking about academic research done in academic health centers by academic physicians. But today, pharmaceutical research has become an almost completely commercial enterprise. It is funded by the drug industry. It is managed by contract research organizations. It's carried out in for-profit testing sites. It's done by doctors in private practice. And it's approved by commercial ethics boards, each of which operates as a for-profit commercial industry. So, you know, in North America, we have built this enormously complicated regulatory system, and we've built it around the assumption that the main threat to research subjects comes from academic researchers. Academic researchers who are too arrogant, too ambitious, and who might be tempted to gamble with the health of subjects, you know, in their pursuit of tenure and fame and Nobel Prizes and recognition and so on. But now that's all changed, because in America today, most trials are supervised by people like Farouk Abuzahab, who doesn't work in a university, who is not an academic, who works entirely in the world of the market. So the question is, what do we make of that? So here's the basic problem. The traditional ethical calculus around clinical trials has always been about this very delicate balance between the interests of the patient on the one hand and the interests of science and generalizable knowledge on the other hand. In medicine, in straight clinical medicine, the patient always comes first, but in science you're looking for knowledge, and so when you have sick people who are in research studies, you've got to figure out some way to balance those two things. How do you generate the knowledge yet also treat the patient? So the question is, what happens to that equation when you introduce money, right? What happens when everybody involved in the clinical research enterprise, each step of the way, is looking at it as a way to make money? So that's my introduction. Let me start with a preliminary answer to that question. What happens when everyone is looking at the enterprise as a way to make money? By showing you this. So about 5 years ago, the Unsafe Structures Board in Miami, Florida, ordered a motel to be demolished. This was a motel that it was a former Holiday Inn that the board had apparently been after for a number of years. It was sort of in a seedy part of town. It was surrounded by this chain link fence. The paint on the walls is peeling, but mainly it's unsafe. It's a fire hazard. Also, the owners of the hotel are housing twice as many people as the structure has been approved to house. That's not the interesting thing about this motel, though. The interesting thing about this motel is that it was no longer a motel. It was actually a drug testing facility owned by a company called SFBC International. In fact, it was not just a drug testing site. It was the largest drug testing site in North America. Before it was demolished, it had 675 beds. It was extremely successful. It was extremely profitable. Just a few years before the motel was demolished, it had been named the third most admired small business in America. So the question is, well, what happened? Well, what happened was this, a cover story in the financial magazine Bloomberg Markets. So in 2005, Bloomberg reported that SFBC was recruiting undocumented immigrants and paying them to test drugs in the motel. It turned out that the medical director didn't actually have a license. She had a degree from an offshore medical school in the Caribbean. The studies had been given ethics approval by a for-profit ethics committee, which was owned by the wife of the company's vice president. They had converted the lobby of the motel to a waiting room. When reporters went to visit, they basically saw Black and Latino people lined up in rows of chairs, who would then wander up to the counter to see a clerk who was sitting behind a glass window, like a clerk in a convenience store, who would pass them a sheet of paper in a plastic jacket that had study numbers, told them how long they would have to check into the hotel, how much money they'd get paid, and they would basically just pick the study that they wanted to be in. Now, there's a background to this SFBC story, and the background goes something like this. Once upon a time, maybe 20 years ago or so, if a drug company wanted to do a clinical trial of a new drug, they'd have to go to universities. And the reason they'd have to go to universities is because that's where the subjects were, right? So they would find a university researcher who's willing to work with industry, and they'd give them the protocol, and it would be submitted to the university IRB, the ethics board, and they'd have the researcher recruit the subjects and then do them at the study, at the university. And that's how it worked in the old days. Now it's all different. The industry, the drug industry, has grown enormously. It's producing a lot more drugs. The studies are a lot more complicated, and they need subjects. They need more subjects, and they need the subjects faster. And so they've decided the way to do this is to bypass universities completely. So all the things that universities used to do can now be done faster and more efficiently in the private sector. So at places like SFBC. And so over the past 15 years or so, all these trials have moved out of universities and into office parks, which is where private companies have set up shop. 15 years ago, 4 out of 5 trials were done in universities. Now 4 out of 5 are done in private testing sites. Now, one of the most interesting developments in this big shift has been the market for healthy volunteers. So healthy volunteers are involved in so-called phase 1 trials. Phase 1 trials are the safety trials, the very first trials that are done right at the beginning of drug development, where the purpose is to decide if the drug is safe and what the dosing should be. So what you need for these trials are healthy volunteers who are willing to check into a research site for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time. Now, as you can probably imagine, that's no picnic. One, you got to have the time to do it, which usually means that you probably don't have a regular job, right? You've got to be willing to take untested drugs, and you've got to be willing to submit to all the blood draws, the urine tests, the physical exams, all the various invasive procedures that may go along with testing the drug. So who's willing to do that? Well, you can guess. The traditional source has been college students. More and more, it's unemployed people, homeless people, contract workers, people just fresh out of jail who can't get regular work, and undocumented immigrants like the ones that they were recruiting at the Miami facility. These are people who didn't have a green card, couldn't get regular work. So the other thing that's happened with these trials is the money. So it used to be that if you volunteered for one of these studies, you would get paid something, but not a huge amount of money. If the companies were offering too much money, the IRB, the Research Ethics Board, would turn it down, saying that's too much. Now that the whole thing is privatized, a subject can easily make $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 for a study. You can make money for recruiting your friends into a study. You can make money by enrolling your children in studies. This is a study at Covance, which would pay $400 per child per 2-day study. The highest paying study I've ever seen, one that's legendary in the guinea pigging community, is a NASA study where they were paying subjects $17,000 essentially to lie in bed without getting out for 3 consecutive months. One brief thing that I should I want to make a note of, just so that I don't forget it. There's sort of sequel to this piece that I'm working on right now that involves the recruitment of sick patients, paying sick people to enroll in research studies, particularly psychiatric patients. So don't let me forget to come back to this when we're done, because things are changing pretty quickly. So who oversees these studies? Well, in the States, it's we have a Federal Office of Human Research Protection in the States, but the Federal Office of Human Research Protection doesn't oversee these studies because they're privately conducted, and OHRP only oversees publicly funded trials. It's not the FDA. the FDA oversees drug development. They're not in the research subject protection business. So that leaves IRBs, the ethics committees, what we call institutional review boards, what you call REBs, or research ethics boards. So these are private companies that the drug industry pays to approve their studies. So you give them a check, they review your study and tell you that it's ethically okay to go ahead. The largest and the best known of these is WIRB, the Western IRB in Olympia, Washington, which also I think has a Canadian office and grosses about $20 million a year. Now, when I mention this SFBC study to people in the research ethics world, a lot of people will often point out, look, that looked bad, but nobody was actually injured in that study, in the SFBC trials. My response is we don't know that. There may have been. I'm not sure that we know one way or the other, but there have been other injuries at other sites involving healthy volunteers at for-profit units. One was in Montreal at an Anapharm facility where 9 healthy subjects and 11 employees tested positive for TB after enrolling in an immunosuppressant study. There's the case of Tracy Johnson, who was a healthy volunteer in an Eli Lilly study, who committed suicide in their research unit while taking the antidepressant Cymbalta. This is a woman with no previous history of any mental problems at all, no history of depression, who hung herself in a bathroom. She was being paid $150 a day. In 2002, the Fabry Research Clinic in Houston recruited a homeless Vietnam vet named Gary Paulsgrove for an antipsychotic trial. He was healthy when he checked into the clinic. 21 days later, he was dead from myocarditis. And it turned out his care was being overseen by an unlicensed clinic assistant, not a physician. Now, injuries are part of the issue, but they're not the only part of the issue. Injuries were actually the sort of thing that IRBs were actually set up to look at. But to me, that's not the remarkable thing about this SFBC story. The remarkable thing to me is that the largest clinical trial site in North America was testing drugs on illegal immigrants in a condemned motel for 10 years, and nobody noticed, right? 10 years. Nobody noticed, and they didn't notice because I doubt anybody ever actually set foot in that hotel. IRBs don't do that, most of them anyway. IRBs review paper protocols. And if they're a for-profit IRB, they're often reviewing those paper protocols from a place thousands of miles away from the research site. IRBs are not used to looking at these kind of questions. IRBs are used to looking at questions like, are you getting informed consent? And what are the risks that are involved in this study? IRBs are not used to asking questions like, did your doctors go to an accredited medical school, or did they go to a for-profit medical school in the Caribbean? They're not used to asking questions like, are you doing the study in a condemned motel? The SFBC story also raises an additional question, and that's a question about the subjects. So the subjects who were lining up at this condemned motel to do the studies are willing to take untested drugs for money. Why do they do it? Well, for years, ethicists and researchers and regulators have told themselves a kind of fairy tale about this, which goes something like, they're doing it because they want to help science. They're doing it because they are our partners in this grand research enterprise that we're embarked on. If you spend any time around these people, though, you'll be hard-pressed to find anybody who is doing this to help science. They're all doing it for the money. That is almost the single motivation for doing these trials. Which raises a further question, which is, if they're doing it for the money, how much should they be paid, right? Is $7,000 for 3 weeks in a research study too much money? Or in fact, is that too little money? Which brings us to my next story. So this is the last story I want to tell, and it comes from a man named Bob Helms. You can see Bob posed here with a lab rat, and the reason is because that's what he does for a living. So let me tell you this story. This story begins in December of 2002, which is when Bob reported to a hospital in Philadelphia to begin a research protocol for an anti-anxiety drug being developed by Merck. 20 subjects in the study, including Bob, and this was a drug delivery study. So what is a drug delivery study? Well, a drug delivery study means that what the subjects would do is take these tablets of this anxiety drug, and then when they had their next bowel movement, they would move their bowels into a little basket. Actually, they called it a hat. So they have to move their bowels into a hat. And then the unlucky staff members had to search through the contents of the hat and retrieve what was left of the tablet and then weigh it. And the difference in the weight was presumably how much of the tablet was absorbed in their body as it passed through their gut. So the pay for this study was just over $3,000. In fact, it was $3,350. And it required the subjects to check into the research facility and stay for 5 different periods, each of which lasted 4 days apiece. So overall, this is a 20-day study. And those periods are separated by little brief windows when they could leave the unit and go home. According to Bob, the first period wasn't even over before he and everybody else on the unit realized that they had made a terrible deal. First of all, this whole fecal collection thing was very smelly and unpleasant, and generally just much, much worse than they had ever imagined it would be. So that was bad. But it wasn't the worst part. The worst part, according to Bob, was the timing, because apparently Merck had had trouble finding subjects for this study, and by the time the study had begun, they had decided to shorten the windows of time that the subjects could get off the unit. So instead of 3 days on the outside, they shortened it to 36 hours. That was bad too, but even that wasn't the worst. The worst was that during those times away from the unit, the study required that they not drink any alcohol. Now, when they had signed up for the study, it was going to take place in September. But by the time they actually started the study, it was December, and the study was going to be taking place over the Christmas and New Year's holiday. So Christmas Eve in a Merck research unit, having your feces collected in a little hat without even the possibility of drinking when you left the unit was way too much for them to bear. And so they thought it wasn't what they had bargained for, and they wanted a pay raise. So the question is, how does a research subject get a pay raise? Well, Bob had an idea, and I think of it as kind of a brilliant idea. His idea was, since the staff was collecting their feces, that all the subjects should swallow little notes that said, "more money," which would then be delivered to the staff in the hat. Isn't that great? God, he's an ingenious man, Bob Helms. Sadly, all the other 19 research subjects vetoed that idea and decided on a more traditional approach, which was to write a memo and deliver it to the staff in the ordinary way. And the memo laid out all their complaints and asked for a pay raise. They asked that the money be increased to $4,500. So we're looking at an $1,150 pay raise. Sponsor's not happy about this. So then the subjects, all the guinea pigs on the unit, start hinting that maybe they might just drop out of the study, that they'd heard there's a better study at another unit in town, and maybe they would just sign up for that study instead. That would have ruined the entire study for Merck. And so once Merck was faced with a sort of mass guinea pig walkout, they agreed on a compromise, which was that they'd pay out an additional $800 per subject. So for Bob, this is sort of a high point of guinea pig collective action. And he claims the only time that this has ever happened before. So the question is, who is Bob Helms? Who is this man, Bob Helms? Well, Bob is a former union organizer. In fact, he's now a current union organizer again, and a veteran of over 80 research studies, and the founder of this zine for pharmaceutical research subjects called Guinea Pig Zero. Guinea Pig Zero's run was, I think, from about 1995 to maybe 2001 or 2002. I started subscribing to Guinea Pig Zero when I was at McGill. I was an early subscriber, maybe one of the very few subscribers, actually. It was really, I think, the first and only publication to explain what it's like to be in a research study from the subject's point of view. This is not exactly a peer-reviewed journal, sort of a homemade publication that Bob would staple together in his apartment with paper that he had stolen from Kinko's, and then would send out to independent bookstores and a few subscribers. It's very dark, very in your face. It's extremely funny. Bob's sensibility is sort of a cross between Emma Goldman and Robert Crumb. He came up with my all-time favorite title for a Guinea Pig Zero article. And it was about a woman who was selling her eggs to a fertility clinic. Bob gave her article the title, "Cluck, Cluck, Gimme a Buck." Actually, this is a cartoon from the zine that I keep on my office door. No more fast food work for me. I've got a career in science. So it was a controversial, but the Guinea Pig Zero's brief run was marked by controversy and legal action. The most interesting parts were these report cards that it would publish in each issue on the conditions at various research facilities. So Bob and his fellow guinea pigs would come back from doing these studies and then report on what it had been like. And if the food was terrible, they'd write about it. And if the venipuncturists were incompetent and couldn't hit a vein, they'd write about it. And if the pay was unfair, they'd write about that. And if they were given a rectal exam for no good reason, they would write about that. And what was really interesting and sort of eye-opening to me was about Guinea Pig Zero is that you could see what guinea pigs actually cared about. If you were checking into a research unit for 3 weeks, it makes a lot of difference just to be treated like a human being. So I feel like, in its own small way, that Guinea Pig Zero was kind of revolutionary, because before Guinea Pig Zero, nobody had really thought of research subjects as a kind of community. Nobody had ever really thought about the possibility that they might band together, that they might agitate for better pay, that they might agitate for better conditions. In fact, nobody really thought much about healthy volunteers as a separate class of subjects from ordinary research subjects, the kind of subjects who have an illness and are enrolling in a trial in order to get treatment for that illness. Everybody just sort of lumped all research subjects together and thought of them as mainly as sort of de facto sick people, right? But these people, Bob and his fellow guinea pig activists, were clearly a different breed. So they're not looking for medical help. They're not looking to help science. They're just poor people looking for money. And what they wanted to know is, why do the ethicists insist on keeping my wages low? Now, that's a good question. Because if you know anything about research ethics, you'll know that paying research subjects is a contested issue. Actually, used to be very contested, less and less contested over time. So the traditional view is that you should not pay subjects any more than a token amount because money is coercive, right? Money is an undue influence on their consent. That money will tempt subjects against their better judgment to take part in studies that are risky and uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. And that would be unacceptable. We can't allow it. And so it's the job of the IRB not to prohibit payment. They never do that. That would be going too far. But to keep payment as low as possible. Why? Because too much money will compromise informed consent. In fact, we can't even admit that the money is payment. We have to call it compensation or a stipend or something like that. Now, what I want to say is, there's definitely merit to that view, right? I'm not sure I would use the phrase coercive, but there's definitely merit to that view. And what's right about that view is that some people are living in such desperate financial circumstances that they could be persuaded to do just about any study, no matter how dangerous it was, if the pay was high enough, right? That's what's right about this view. What you have to remember, though, is that it's wrong to persuade somebody to take part in a dangerous study, even if you're not paying them anything, right? Just because you're not paying the subjects doesn't mean that a risky study is okay. Risky studies are still a problem. And what we do by allowing some payment but keeping it low is essentially to make sure that only the poorest and the most desperate people are willing to do these studies. So I think the operative term here is not coercion. The operative term is exploitation. So the analogy is sweatshop labor. You take advantage of a vulnerable person's circumstances in order to get them to do things that most people wouldn't agree to do. So healthy volunteers, I think, are in a very different kind of situation from the sick people who take part in research studies. Sick people are vulnerable. Sick people are often desperate for medical help. Sick people are often unhappy with the treatment that they're getting outside the study. They're willing to do studies because they want to get a different kind of treatment. Researchers who are doing those studies may also be in charge of the patient's clinical care, which can also present problems. So there are all kinds of reasons to keep financial incentives out of that relationship. Healthy volunteers are different because these are not sick people who are looking for treatment. These are healthy people looking for money. And when other healthy people who are looking for money decide to do something that is potentially dangerous or unpleasant, like taking a risky job, we don't think of that choice exclusively in terms of their informed consent, right? We don't say to a miner or a meat packer, sorry, we can't allow the company to pay you a living wage because that would be coercive. No, we think of it in terms of justice. We think of it in terms of exploitation. And we say, we've got to make sure that your workplace is safe. We've got to make sure that you are treated fairly, that you're treated decently, and we've got to make sure that you're paid a fair wage. So why shouldn't we think of this relationship between pharmaceutical companies and guinea pigs as a kind of labor relationship? Because that's essentially the way the guinea pigs see it, right? These are essentially employees working for pharmaceutical companies. The problem is that we in bioethics resist thinking of it that way, and so guinea pigs get nothing of the protections that other workers get. Their workplaces are not regulated as workplaces. They don't get regular safety inspections. They don't have the right to a minimum wage. They don't have the right to organize. They don't have the right to belong to unions. Essentially, they're working, but they've got none of the protections and the rights of workers. They don't even, in the States, they don't even have health insurance. So if they are injured in a research study, there's a good chance that they'll have to pay for their own medical care themselves. So if we think of this as a problem of exploitation rather than coercion, the question would be, how do we fix it? Well, we've got to remove the exploitative conditions. This means two basic things. One, the first thing we've got to fix is the lack of oversight. We have a broken oversight system, and we've got to find a way to fix it. We need people who are on the ground looking at trial sites and who are not paid by the companies doing the trials. Second issue is payment. Why not remove the caps on payment and see what the market would bear, right? It might be that guinea pigs are not being paid too much, but that they're being paid too little. They are being paid, for example, far, far less than the researchers who are doing the trials. And if we were to take the caps on payment off, we would have to put some additional requirements in order to protect the subjects, right? In my opinion, it is outrageous that sponsors can require subjects to pay for their own medical care if they are injured in these kind of research studies. That's got to be stopped. In fact, I would say that in the States, that sponsors should be required to subsidize a system of health insurance for subjects. Because the other thing about these subjects is that they are largely uninsured, and as a result will not have access to the drugs that they're testing, even if they're approved. Again, that's a fundamental question of justice. If we rely on these people to test our drugs, we've got to make sure that they have access to the drugs once they're approved. And if they have no health insurance, that's never going to happen. So on the cover, let me just finish by showing you this. The cover of one issue of Guinea Pig Zero, Bob included a quotation from Tennessee Williams, "We're all of us guinea pigs in the laboratory of God," which I think has sort of a nice irony to it, because we may be all guinea pigs in the laboratory of God, but we're not all guinea pigs in the laboratory of Eli Lilly or Pfizer or Wyeth or Quintiles or Par Excel or Covance. Only the poorest people are guinea pigs in those laboratories. Are they being exploited? Yes, absolutely, they're being exploited. We pay them to test the safety of experimental drugs that they'll probably not be able to afford once the drugs are approved. We pay them to do it under an oversight system that can't ensure their safety. And if they're injured while they're taking the drugs, we tell them, sorry, you're on your own now. Now, given what guinea pigs are being asked to do, it's tempting to say that payment is one of the few parts of the system that's not exploitative, right? In effect, we have developed a system of drug testing in which we've decided that it's okay to test drugs on poor people for money. Now, that's not the system that I would have designed. It's not the system that I would prefer, but that is the system that we have. And so the question is, are we prepared to look at that system hard and clearly and make it fair, or are we just going to look away and leave it as it is? And so I will stop there and turn it over to Trudeau, who I should say is my co-author on a lot of this work and who's done a lot of work on these issues himself.
So John invited me to say something after Carl's talk, and he had the idea actually that somebody had to, it would be good if somebody had a counterpoint against Carl, looking also at the somewhat provocative title of Carl's presentation. But I immediately said to John, and John was actually fine with that I wouldn't say very much against Carl, because I co-authored a couple of pieces with him, and I largely agreed actually with much of Carl's analysis. So my comments will not so much be a counterpoint, but more some brief reflections on Carl's presentation now, but certainly also his larger work, particularly also the work that is reflected in his recent book, White Coat, Black Hat. So I don't have the same style as Carl has. So one of the values I think in Carl's work, and also his book on enhancement, is his incredible style, which I think is rare or unique in bioethics. People have referred to his style actually as Dickensian style in writing stories about real human people. So the strength of his writing is certainly also this area. The stories that he can reveal and shares with us also in this presentation are stories about real people, not just numbers in research studies that aim at creating statistical evidence, not only stories that or abstract stories that lawyers use to make legal arguments. So it's about people having dreams and hopes with particular humor as well. People who are interesting human beings. So I think in many of Carl's books you'll write about the marginal people who come up with very interesting reflections on life that we can actually quite learn a lot about. So a legal commentary then after such a talk is in comparison bleak and dull. So I'll try to make some general comments though about what I think Carl's writings and Carl's certainly critical reflections on the industry surrounding clinical trials and pharmaceutical research tell us about or can tell somebody working, for example, in the area of law and regulation. And so there are a couple of dilemmas that I struggle with also when we've been co-authoring things that I simply want to put out there on the table for further discussion. This dilemma is about how we should intervene, how we should deal with some of these dilemmas. How should we deal, how can we use the law, regulations, guidelines, professional policies to promote better research practices on consumers and research participants. And one of the things that we certainly have to realize is that regulations and interventions have consequences. So one of the things that Carl has been discussing is focusing on improving the conditions for research subjects, for example, in the North American context. Well, we know that there are always consequences when we strengthen labor standards, for example, in North America. Businesses move south. We're dealing here with a very powerful industry that is increasingly moving to the south. And so Carl makes these recommendations, I've made these recommendations as well. We kind of realize that the stricter we implement regulations actually in the north, the more we see also, it's not the only reason, but the more we see people also moving to the south. You simply look at some of the numbers and you'll see that there are a couple of interesting publications in this area, that the number of foreign investigators has been significantly increasing, that the number of research subjects in the south has been significantly increasing. So when we talk about vulnerability in North America, I would say it's vulnerability multiplied in the south, where we are dealing with research subjects who are in the industry's world treatment naive. So these are people who are interesting for the industry because they actually are on no particular medication and are therefore cleaner subjects to use in the context of clinical trials. So that's one consequence. So how do we deal with that? Doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything here, but we certainly have to think about dealing with these issues on a global scale. Think about international measures, international standards, maybe even international conventions, although I know how cumbersome these are to be established. Second point I would want to put on the table is that if you think about regulation, so as a legal scholar, my immediate reflection is better inspections, better control, stricter standards, penalties, and so on. We have to also think about the consequences of particular types of regulation long term. And so one of the things that I'm interested in particularly is that if you look through the history of the regulation of pharmaceutical products, you actually realize that the legal interventions that we've implemented in the context of pharmaceutical regulation particularly following thalidomide and other very serious consequences where people were severely disabled or killed as a result of unsafe products that were brought into the market. The regulations that we have in place now are actually obviously focused on had a good purpose. They were aimed at ensuring that products were safer and more effective when they were brought on the market. But these are actually also the regulations that have resulted in what we have today, which is a very cumbersome bureaucratic system surrounding medical research, which has actually created an entirely new industry with its own pressures, its own financial drives, its own competitive enterprises that Carl has been discussing in his presentation. And we have seen that it's particularly this industry also that has gained through these bureaucratic requirements, and because they had to be established, they have gained power and control actually over much of the conduct of clinical trials in the world. So much of the information that we currently have about drug safety and effectiveness is in the hands of an industry which works directly for the pharmaceutical industry, which actually is largely the result of regulations that we implemented. And so it is in that context, as a result of regulations, that we actually contributed to the commodification of the research subjects that Carl was discussing. So they've become a market commodity in a large bureaucratic system which is surrounded by industry itself. So the consequences are at an individual level. It means that people are treated in a certain way that actually I think people who work sometimes in the industry forget about the fact that these are real people who suffer, who are vulnerable, who can be harmed. And we kind of focus on procedures to protect them, and we forget about dealing with them as individual human beings. But the problems are also more systemic, namely that these human subjects participate in research that aims at creating scientific evidence of safety and effectiveness, which determines very much what we know about pharmaceutical products that are on the market out there today. This was not the topic of Carl's talk this evening, but was something actually he discussed in the law school at noon, where he showed and criticized also how actually research has become a marketing tool of pharmaceutical products themselves. And so it's again partly regulations and regulatory structures that were well intended that have contributed to the fact that we now have a lot of the creation of scientific evidence in the hands of those who have a direct financial outcome in the evidence itself. It explains also the large number of trials that are being undertaken. That research has become really a marketing tool to obtain desirable results. So maybe we have way too much research. Maybe a lot of the research that is taking place actually is part of the marketing scheme, which also explains why subjects can be exploited in clinical trials because there is such a competitiveness. So what to do about that? I would say the lawyers may contribute to that in thinking about better regulatory systems, better regulatory structures. And in the meantime, I would say we certainly need people like Carl to describe with a very powerful narrative and with a sensitivity that few people in the field can actually so well express in his papers and in his writings. We need people who ring the alarm bell in a powerful way. Use also the media. So Carl will probably be the first to admit that he increasingly wants to have an impact by using not so much the academic journals, many of which are never read, we know that, but that you actually have to kind of focus on also impacting on systems through powerful narrative in publications that are read. And so I'm very happy actually to see that Carl has been able to publish so widely in this area and is also going around in these types of settings, making us aware actually in a very powerful way what's wrong with the system. So it's up to us to kind of take up the challenge and think about it further. So I'll open it now for questions.